Hi, it's Tuesday, December 29th, 2015. This morning I'll be making a relatively short video about how democracy has made the world safe for big government, war, and fiat money. And yeah, I've been thinking about this subject for the last day or so, and it's very interesting because this morning on LBC radio there was a presenter called Ian Payne, and he was talking about a new law that has going to come in the books in the UK, and he talked about it on Twitter. Ian Payne, he's a radio presenter on LBC, and he said, and I quote, social media bosses face 2 years jail time if they warn users MI5 are watching them. So basically here in the UK, the bosses at Google, Facebook, Twitter, all the companies that give people access to social media, they'll be arrested for 2 years. They could face arrest for 2 years if they warn, their customers that MI5, which is the secret service in the UK, is watching them. So it's quite interesting. I was thinking about this subject of big government, and lo and behold, this morning they're talking about it on the radio. And the other thing that comes to mind about this subject of democracy, big government, war, and fiat money is President Woodrow Wilson, because on April 2nd, 1917, when he went before a joint session of the U.S. Congress to sell the war to the United States, so to sell World War I to the U.S., he said that the United States would be making the world safer for democracy, and the big threat then, the big boogeyman was Germany. And the reason why I've turned around this comment and said democracy has made the world safer for big government, war, and fiat money is because if you look at some statistics, it actually shows that democracy, whatever you want to call it, the system we've had in the last 115 years has actually made the world safer for big government. And by that I mean, government spending as a share of GDP. It's made the world safer for wars. After World War I, or the Great War, how it was called at the time, we actually had World War II, we had the Korean War, we had the Cold War, we had the Vietnam War, we've had the Gulf War, the Falklands War, and now we have the War on Terror, and all the war in the Middle East. And the government as well, has grown and grown and grown. And statistics-wise, I've looked at a website, and I'm going to put the link below. It's called usgovernmentspending.com. And if you look here, and I'm quoting this from this website, this is U.S. total government spending since 1900. Government spending at the start of the 20th century was less than 7% of GDP. It vaulted to almost 30% of GDP by the end of World War I, and then settled down to 10% of GDP in the 1920s. So yeah, that's normal, I guess. During wartime, government spending has to increase, especially as such a big war. But it's interesting, because the U.S. wasn't in that war for that long. But nevertheless, it came back down, right, to 10%. And then in the 1930s, total government spending doubled to 20% of GDP. And you wonder, there's no war in the 1930s. But there was the scrapping of the gold standard domestically by FDR, or Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in 1933. And with the anchor of gold being pulled out from the U.S. domestic economy in 1933, and the devaluation of the paper dollar, FDR was able to institute the the welfare state, or the New Deal, and I guess that's why government spending went up so much in the 1930s. And then it goes on to say defense spending in World War II drove overall government spending over 50% of GDP before declining to 22% of GDP in the late 1940s. So again, we had a war and it went even higher, government spending. Then it came back down, but it's above the 10% from, where it came down to after World War I. Now it only came down to 22%. So you see big government is creeping and creeping, after the Second World War. The 1950s began a steady increase to about 36% of GDP by 1982. So that corresponds to the period, if you include the post-1971 period where President Nixon basically destroyed the gold standard internationally. You've had another increase, in welfare and big government. And then in the 1990s, government spending actually stayed pretty constant, around 33 to 35% of GDP. And then it says here, but in the aftermath of the crash of 2008, spending has jogged up to 40% of GDP. So it's never been higher, with the exception of during World War II, government spending in the U.S. And prior, to World War I in 1900, government spending, was only 7% of GDP. And the other interesting thing is that, a lot of that government spending prior to World War I was mostly local. So the federal government was actually very small, but not anymore. So, I would argue, that democracy, whatever system we've got now, has not made the world safe for freedom or small government. It's actually made this democracy we've got these days has made the world safe for big government, war, and fiat money, or the central banking system. If anything, if freedom is defined by small government and freedom to do, what the individual wants to do without government interference, we don't have freedom anymore. If anything, we are now more under an authoritarian government than we were back in 1917 when Woodrow Wilson made that comment. And the other point I like to make about freedom and big government is to talk about passports. I was reading on Wikipedia about passports, and it said that, a rapid, and I quote, a rapid extension of rail travel and wealth in Europe beginning in the mid-19th century led to a unique dilution of the passport system for approximately 30 years prior to World War I. Oh, there's that World War I again. The speed of trains, as well as the number of passengers that crossed multiple borders, made enforcement of passport laws difficult. The general reaction was the relaxation of passport requirements. In the latter part of the 19th century and up to World War I, passports were not required. On the whole, for travel within Europe and crossing a border was a relatively straightforward procedure. Consequently, comparatively few people held passports. And then it goes on to say, during World War I, European governments introduced border passport requirements for security reasons and to control the emigration of people with useful skills. These controls remained in place after the war, becoming a standard. So, why did they remain in place if there was no more war? Why? And it makes you wonder about, what LBC was talking about today, because all these draconian and rules and laws that, invade people's privacy and civil liberties, they're being brought in because they're supposed to protect us against terrorism. But, what if the war on terror ends? Are they going to scrap all this? I don't think so. Look at the passport. They didn't scrap passports after World War I. And if you talk to someone about this today, they say, oh, but the world is so much more technologically advanced. People travel around. We need passports to control, people and movement. But if you look at what happened in the 19th century, it's totally opposite. The world became more accessible to people, and technology advanced. People could travel more, and actually people became freer, and they didn't need passports. So it's bogus, this argument that just because we're more technologically advanced and we can travel around the world that we need passports. Maybe it's because of the welfare state, because each country, they have different doses of welfare state. And the reason they need a passport is that, you don't want people coming from a poor country, supposedly poor country, to a country where welfare is abundant. So they will spend on that welfare. That's what I think the reason of for the passport is. Because if there was no welfare state and, the world was fairly prosperous and free, why would you stop people from moving around and, living somewhere else, living wherever they wanted? And that's what kind of happened in the 19th century. But World War I put an end to all that. So, yeah. And just another, conclusion to this little video. And I bring back, fiat money and central banking, because I talk a lot about these subjects, as you will have seen from my previous videos. So I think they all go hand in hand, like the big governments, fiat money, and central banking. And, we've had gradual, especially in the United States and Western Europe and the UK, which 100 and 150 years ago, the US and the UK are a lot freer than they're now. And we are, people living in the UK and the US, it's always represented, place where people are relatively free compared to other countries. And that's why I bring this up. But, yeah, and it goes hand in hand, I think, that we've had, the Federal Reserve Act passed in 1913, and the Federal Reserve Bank founded in 1914. We had the domestic gold standard scrapped in the U.S. in 1933. We also had a lot of the European countries going off gold after World War I. We've had the scrapping of international gold standard in 1971 by Nixon. All of this has led to bigger government. And, if that's democracy, then it's actually made the world, safe for big government, war, and fiat money. It hasn't made the world freer or, more democratic at all. If you consider democracy being where people are free from big government and authority. What we have now is authoritarianism, more than we did 115 years ago. And that's what democracy has done. And I'll end with a quote by Alan Greenspan, who in spite of having been chairman of Federal Reserve Bank for almost 20 years, back in his younger days, he actually defended freedom and the gold standard. And he said in, one of his most famous essays back in the 60s, entitled Golden Economic Freedom, he says, "In the absence of the gold standard, there is no way to protect savings from confiscation through inflation. There is no safe store of value. If there were, the government would have make its holding illegal, as was done in the case of gold. If everyone decided, for example, to convert all his bank deposits to silver or copper or any other good, and thereafter declined to accept checks as payments of goods, bank deposits would lose their purchasing power, and government-created bank credit would be worthless as claims on goods. Financial policy of the welfare state requires that there be no way for the owners of wealth to protect themselves. This is the shabby secret of the welfare statists against gold. Deficit spending is simply a scheme for the confiscation of wealth. Gold stands in the way of this insidious process. It stands as a protector of property rights. If one grasps this, one has no difficulty in understanding the statists' antagonism toward the gold standard. Well, that was Alan Greenspan back in 1966, and things have only gotten worse. And yeah, the last 100 years, democracy has made the world safe for big government, war, and fiat money. Hopefully that will change in the future. Take care. Happy New Year. Goodbye.